Hello, everyone. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I am peachy. A little tired, but peachy nonetheless.
Oh, that's one of those terms that I love. You don't hear it that often. Every once you hear somebody say, I'm real ducky, you know, and on a similar vein. But yeah, it's nice to hear the old things coming back every so often. But
I agree.
uh, speaking of old things, we don't want to refer to our listeners or viewers as old, but if you are returning to us, we thank you very, very much. If you are just finding out about us, thank you. If you enjoy our content, please consider clicking the subscribe button, click the like. That tells the metric that you are a fan. And please tell your friends and family. We'd like to expand the podcast as much as we can. Down below in the description, there will be links to everything, our Facebook groups, Patty's books on Amazon, Buy Me a Coffee, pretty much any. And if there's any relevant topic from any episode, that will be down there as well, provided I can find the hyperlink to put it down there. So with that, I hope that's everything that I normally say. And then here's where I say, what's our topic for today?
Well, today I'm visiting old friends. So I recently had a conversation with two of my sons individually. And in this conversation, they wanted to know why I don't tell my stories from the books more often. And I said, oh, nobody wants to hear those. They can get them if they want to read them, blah, blah, blah. And they said, Mom, you got a bunch of stories you never tell anybody but us. So I decided to fulfill their wish and tell the stories.
I told you when I read your books, I hear it in your voice, which is interesting. Yeah, and it's
Yeah, I
how I
would
want to hear it.
imagine.
But now I
So
get to hear the real thing.
I picked some of either some stories that aren't well known, some that are my favorite, some that are my kids' favorites, a couple that just have a lot of meaning to me, and you'll see why whenever I tell them. And just thought we'd start with some stories. Tonight's a good night for a ghost story.
I'm all ears.
All right. So the first story I wanted to tell was that of it's called Captain Jack in one of the books. I may not even give you the names for some of the others, but this one is a really early story. And so to set the scene for this, it is 1750. This man comes into the wilds of what is now Huntington County. It would have been Bedford County at that point in time. And it's literally rough wilderness. There's very few people there. And he comes with his wife and his two little children, a little boy and a little girl. And he's not super sociable, but he's pleasant. And he builds a little cabin. They start up their life. They have a cow, and he's cutting hay for the cow and trying to break ground for a little bit of a garden so that they have food to eat for the winter, that kind of a thing. And he's also a hunter, and he tells everybody he's a good hunter. He's an excellent hunter. Well, they come to realize very quickly that he's an excellent marksman, period. Like, this dude can shoot like nobody's business. Like, he's highly trained. And they ask him questions. He has a really nice gun, a very expensive gun, something that an aristocrat would own. But he's like, oh, I want it. I kind of played poker with somebody and I won the gun. And that he's always hedging whenever anybody tries to find out who he is, where he came from, what have you. So the stories in this little village of Shirleysburg begin to expound. He's the bastard son of a rich nobleman in England, and he's been sent here to make his fortune. He's the second son of a nobleman from England, and he's been sent here because his brother inherited everything. And and on with these kinds of imaginary, romantic, embroidered stories, to which he never says yes or no to any of it. He just minds his own business, laughs when he hears them, and says, oh, that's hilarious, and just keeps on going. Now, everybody who knows this man, who's seen him and his family interact, realizes very quickly this is a love match. He absolutely adores his wife, and his children are the pride of his life. And so he would go off for like 4 or 5 days and go hunting. Sometimes he'd even get enough game he could share with neighbors. And in return, they would share, corn seed and different things with him. And that's really how the wilderness got broken. And this would have been at the time of Pontiac's rebellion. So those who don't know it, Pontiac was a Native American man. He um, had seen the handwriting on the wall about what was going on between the French, the British, and the native people. And he realized that either side was going to kill them all. They were going to get wiped out. He thought he had the best chance with the French because they weren't nearly as aggressive as the British. But he convinced all these Native American tribes to back him, even though they were traditionally enemies. And then he went on this terror, murdering people. Now, I want everybody to understand before I go any further, this is how the frontier was conquered on both sides. So you could be a woman in your wigwam, tent, whatever you want to call them, because there were different types of houses for different tribes of people. And you haven't done a thing to anybody, and they'll come in and they'll kill you and your whole family. But it turned around, it's the same way on the other side too. If you're sitting in a little rough cabin of one room with your 3 children and your husband, and they decide to burn your cabin down with you all in it, they'll kill you too. And there was no rhyme or reason. This was a battle to the bitter end on both sides. It wasn't about land rights. It wasn't about industry or any of that. It was about who was not going to die of starvation. That's at the end of it. That's exactly what it was all about. People on both sides were extremely desperate because the first people who came here were not the aristocrats, not into the frontier. They came to the places that became settled, Philadelphia, York, Lancaster. But the frontier, those were poor, destitute people who were taking their last chance because in England they were starving. And out here they might not starve. And that's a huge chance. And this guy was just like the rest of them. He was out there trying to not starve and to not let his children starve. That's really his entire story. Now, what happens is he goes away for 4 or 5 days on a hunt. And when he returns, he finds the smoldering remains of the cabin that he left his wife and children in. And they're butchered bodies. They were hacked to pieces. Their scalps were taken. It was horrendous to see. And of course, neighbors, and when I say neighbors, I use that term loosely. I'm not talking the dude that lives next door. I'm talking the guy 5 miles away. Notice the smoke, but by the time you see the smoke, you know it's too late. They're already dead. So you don't ride in until after it stops. And that was pretty much how it worked on the frontier. And the neighbors came the next morning and found him finishing the burial of his wife and children. He was as brokenhearted as a man could possibly be. He had lost everything. He had a will to live and desire to fight for. And he asked around. He tried to find out exactly who they were, where they came from, what the point of all of this was, because he had neither harmed anybody at that point in time. He had just been minding his own business. And eventually, of course, he comes to understand that it's part of Pontiac's rebellion or Pontiac's war, and that his family literally just happened to be in the wrong place when the natives walked through. And so they just killed them all. And in fairness, had it been the other way around, it would have happened in reverse, and there could have very well have been a Native American family living in their structure, and a group of whites would kill them. In fact, we're going to talk about that later on tonight. But so you understand the stakes, they're really basic. I want everybody to understand that it was just really basic. It wasn't who was not going to die of starvation. And after that, he went away for a little while. He went into the woods, and nobody saw him for a few weeks. And then when he comes back, he's angry, like angry in the way that only a human soul can be angry. And he says, I can't fix what happened to my wife and kids, but what I can do is I can make sure it doesn't happen to anybody else's wife and kids. So he puts together this group of rangers, and he begins to kill every Native American he can come across, everyone. There was no rhyme, no reason, any more than there was on the other side. They were the enemy now. They had taken his sole reason for life. And he becomes known as the hunter of the Juniata, the black hunter, the great hunter. There's just a lot of different different stories about this man and what he was and who he was and all of this. Obviously, folklore builds a romantic picture, but the fact that he existed, there is no doubt. There are letters, journals, local documents that indicate that and tell bits and pieces of his story from people writing to somebody they knew and saying this is what's going on, or we're a little safer now because the Black Hunter's here and blah blah blah. And it towards the end of his life, he and he wasn't an old man, but he kind of wore out. Like, I think that kind of anger and hate burns you up inside. And there was this place on a mountain within a few miles of where his cabin had been, where he would often take solace. Today it's known as Jack's Mountain. You can look it up. It exists. And yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Isn't that where the 1,000 Steps is?
Jack's Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
There was a little spring up there, and he would often camp there for days and days on end. And I don't know if the spring even exists now because people reroute things and weather and nature reroutes them. So I'm not sure if it's even there. But there was a little spring up there, and he would often camp there. People would come across him sitting there. If you wanted to talk to him, that was a good place to look for him. It was likely that sooner or later he'd return to that spot because he did so quite often. And the story changes depending on who tells it, that he died of his broken heart there at Jack's Mountain, that he was killed there at Jack's Mountain, or he died of old age, whichever one you choose to believe. All three have been sputtered through the history books at some point or another. But there seems to be very little doubt that he died near the spring on Jack's Mountain. And that's in fact why it got the name, because he became very famous in the frontier for his protection of the native of the local populace. So you can imagine, if you have this guy who's willing to literally die to protect you and your family, you like him a lot. And the word would spread, and people would talk about the hunter of the Juniata and all of this. And he became very famous, so his death spread as well, and the story of him spread. So it's kind of hard when the story started at 1750. It's kind of hard to take all the little bits of folklore and pull them away, but I've tried the best I can to get that veneer off of there and let you know this is the story of a man whose heart was broken and who decided to protect other people from what his family couldn't be protected from. And they say he haunts it up there, that people have come to that little spring and seen it, or they've seen this man dressed in black skins walking by. And can you imagine, you're sitting there as a hiker and you're, kind of exhausted, and you see this guy come up to the spring, lean down, looking like something out of a old movie. And he gets a drink of water and he stands up and he either acknowledges you or doesn't, depends on who you talk to, and just turns around and walks away. Some people say he literally just fades away in front of them, but it's as though he's letting them know, I'm still here, still watching. It's all good. And I happen to have always had a little twinge for that story, because it is the story of the truth of what happened in this country at the very beginning. People like to add a lot of political aspirations and interpretations and crap, and all of that's possibly true, possibly valid in a lot of ways. But when it came to the individual, it was not about politics. It was about who was going to not die. And that makes people passionate and mean sometimes on both sides. The Native Americans thought if they could just be gross and gory enough, they could scare people away. Like they would kill somebody and put their head in a pot and leave it on the doorstep of the family. So whenever they picked up the pot and opened it up, they'd find Dad's head in it. I mean, both sides were just as vile when it came to this. And there was a lot of geopolitical stuff going on, but not at this level. At this level, it was literally who doesn't die. So, and that's going to be a theme that'll come back to us later on, because it is the truth of a lot of the stories of the ghosts of the older stories that haunt these mountains. And Pennsylvania is nothing but mountains, for those who don't know. It's a huge swath of mountains in the Appalachian Mountains. I live on what's called the Allegheny Plateau. And there are tons of tales, and these tales go back to the 1600s and sometimes further back than that. So that's one of the stories I wanted to tell. Another story, this is one that I've had requested by some people, and that's the story of the Ridge Road Monster. I haven't told it for a little while. And
Oh,
I think,
goody.
oh, goody. My kids do that too. They do. So in the book, I believe it's called The Giant Spectre, but I honestly, if I ever redo the book, I'm going to call it The Ridge Road Monster because that's more accurate. And I came by this story because it happened in part in front of me. So I was like 13, 14 years old, and there was this couple that lived at the end of the Ridge Road in a shack, and I can't explain it any better than that. It was really rough place to live. They had running water and an indoor commode, and that's the best I could say for them. They were dirt poor, and the house wasn't in good shape, and they had several young kids that were young adults, mostly men, and their mother got cancer. And she was a friend of my mom's. So on the summer that I was 14, I volunteered to stay with them and help take care of her because she needed somebody. And there are things when you get cancer in certain areas that you don't want your sons to have to do. And so finding someone to help her, back then there were not all the resources there are today. There weren't nurses coming in all over the place and a whole industry built around that. So you just literally had to hope that somebody would care enough to help. And I had 3 months off, and it seemed like the right thing, so that's what we did. And I'm sitting on the porch one night with their youngest son, and the Ridge Road was literally just across this little 2-lane highway, and it was a dirt road. At that time, on 2/3 of it, the far end of it, there was a little tiny piece of pavement, went back about a 1/4 mile with 4 or 5 houses on it, but mostly it was just abandoned territory. And I said to Doug, this young man, I want to go for a walk. Let's go for a walk. And he's absolutely freaked out when he understood that I meant through the Ridge Road. And, because that was the only place to walk. And he's like, absolutely not. You can't do that. That's crazy. It's insane. I forbid you. And I'm like, dude, chill out. Because it made no sense to me. And then he tells me this preposterous tale. But he said it with a sincerity that made me really question. Was he jerking my chain and trying to scare me because he was a 14-year-old boy and I was a 14-year-old girl and he was trying to freak me out? Because there was a part of it that sounded like he truly believed what he was saying. So this is his story. About 2 years earlier, that would have been, he was about 12. He was tasked with feeding the dogs. His dad was the local county dog collector or catcher. And at the time, you didn't have like you have these buildings now and tons of pens and it's all professional. Back then, dudes just like tied dogs to a box across the road from their house. And after they didn't get picked up by somebody in a month or two, you shot them. That's exactly what happened back then. So his old man was, he always liked dogs, so he had a hard time with the shooting them part. So anytime you went to his house, there was 12, 14, 16 dogs across the road at these pens, and they weren't well-to-do, but somehow they managed to come up with big bags of dog food. I don't know how that happened, but it was always big bags of dog food, and it was Doug's job to feed the dogs. So on this particular night, it was a late summer night, dogs were barking and baying and carrying on and what have you, and his dad said, did you feed the dogs? And he's like, no, I didn't feed the dogs. He's like, why? He's like, I don't know. I got busy with something else. I forgot. And it got dark and it's just creepy over there. Now, the only dog that belonged there full time was a big German Shepherd named Bicket. And Bicket was so big he could bust a basketball with his jaws. He was a huge dog. And nobody looked at that dog and thought, I can take him, or he's a pussycat. This dog was huge. And so Doug's dad got mad and he told him, he said, you get just over there and feed those dogs and get them water. So Doug goes over and digs a big bucket into a dog food and starts over to, to feed the dogs. And the dogs are yipping and yapping. As you can well imagine, they're hungry, they're thirsty, they want something to eat and drink, and he's the guy that does it. So they're excited. And then all of a sudden, as he's feeding, he gets to Bicket, and in silence. And he looks around, and all the dogs are back in their boxes, and they're kind of hunched back in, even Bicket. And Bicket wasn't afraid of anything. I knew that dog. He wasn't afraid of people. He wasn't afraid of anything. And Doug kind of looked around, and at the edge of the ridge road, there's a pole light. And standing right under the pole light, where he could see it very well, was this being. And he described it like this. He said it was about 7, 8 foot tall. It was thin, like skin pulled over a corpse, like a skeleton, and gray. Its arms were too long, and it had that skeletal kind of face, and his eyes were red. And it was just standing there watching him. Didn't make any move to do anything, but whatever it was enough to quell those dogs. He screamed, he dropped the bucket, and he took off running, got into the house, told his dad this crazy story. And he was sure his dad was going to like get the belt and, whack him, because he had broken his rules a second time that night. But he didn't. That was the craziest part of the thing to Doug's way of looking. Instead, his dad just kind of looked at his mom and he said, "You better tell him." And they told him that when Doug's dad had bought the place, they'd only been there maybe 2, 3 years. The kids were all really little back then. And there were a lot of mouths to feed and very little money and very little work. And so it was really imperative that his dad get deer, because that would be the meat supply for the winter. So on the first day of buck season, he goes out. It's cold and damp and rainy, which is a miserable way to spend a day in the woods. And he climbs up on a tree branch, and he's got his peanut butter and jelly sandwich and his little quart jar of coffee, and he's kind of making the best of it. And he sees nothing. In fact, the woods are dead silent. And anybody who's ever been out in the woods should know it's alive with birds and squirrels and chipmunks and rabbits and trees snapping and all kinds of noises that you hear all the time. And it's a calliope of noises if you're knowing what you're listening for. And it was dead silent. And it kind of freaked him out a little bit, but he kept thinking about those hungry kids. So he sat and he sat, and his fingers got numb and his toes got cold. And he sat a little longer, and then just as it started to get dusky, you have to be out of the woods by dark, he jumped down off this tree and he started heading down the little dirt road toward the shack. And now the road was so covered with trees that it kind of almost made a tunnel in places, and it would get really dark early. So he's walking along, and ahead of him he sees a figure moving in the dusk, and he yells out to the guy, which was something you would do in the 1960s, "Hey, mister, did you have any luck?" And the guy didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge him in any way, and he thought, well, that's just strange, because everybody local would talk to you. And he yelled again, "Hey, mister, you have any luck?" The guy didn't say a thing, but he just kept walking. His arms were moving, as like he was just in his stride. So he tries to speed up a little bit to catch up to him. It's the first living soul he's seen all day, but he can't seem to break that barrier between the two of them. He just, no matter how fast he walks, this guy just manages to maintain the same distance. And then they hit this spot where there's a break in the foliage, and so it's much brighter. And that's where the being stops, and it turns around and it looks at him. And he stopped dead too, because it was exactly the same thing, that tall, cadaverous, gray-skinned, red-eyed being. Now, the woods down in that area are filled with sinkholes. For those who don't know what they are, they're like this piece of ground where the earth just kind of opens up, like a hole kind of develops under the ground, and eventually it erodes away enough that the top of the ground begins to fall in, and it becomes a hole. Sometimes they go fast, sometimes they go slow, but this particular section of woods, probably for a good 20 miles, is just known for all the sinkholes. So there's a sinkhole right off the edge of the dirt road, and this being looks back at him with his red eyes glowing. He's terrified into absolutely, completely, immobility. And This thing steps down over the edge of the road, takes 2 or 3 steps, and steps into one of those sinkholes. It throws its head back and starts bellowing this horrifying, mournful scream. And then it starts sinking down into the ground as though it's being swallowed by the very earth. At that point, Doug's dad broke out a dead run and took off as fast as he could go. When he got back to the house, it was hours and hours. He couldn't say anything. He was shaking. He was crying. And it took him till the next morning to tell his wife what he had seen. So when Doug told him that story, probably a good 15 years after that first experience, his dad didn't argue with him. His dad couldn't argue with him. His dad had seen that thing himself. Now, the Ridge Road's a little more populated on both ends. It has a little bit of pavement on both ends tucked up there on the ends than it used to be. Some of the people that were the first people to build back in there have made time to find me when I'm over that way and tell me that they've seen him standing in their backyards. There's a farmer down that way who has a field that bucks up on the other side of that little corpse of woods there that where the Ridge Road monster supposedly is. And they've told me, he's told me, his son has told me, and a nephew, that on different occasions they're mowing the hayfield right there that backs up to that region. And they've seen this guy, that's what they call him, the guy, standing there with the red eyes glowing, thin and cadaverous. They said, I don't think he means anybody any harm. He just seems curious about what humans are doing.
That was always the
Yeah.
impression I got when I both read the story and you've mentioned it before. So yeah, and any idea what it could actually be?
Earth spirits, maybe. They're in South America. There are a ton of stories of similar beings. They seem to populate areas where there are sinkholes. They're described very similar, and they're described as traveling through the sinkholes. And I've mentioned many times over the years that I have a penchant for Elliot O'Donnell books, and Elliot O'Donnell wrote a story about 1904. Oh, and it's a fascinating story. And he was in Whitehall, New York. So Elliot O'Donnell is a young man, comes to the United States to try to see what this country's all about. He's from England. And he takes a couple years to work his way across the country. So he would pick up a job someplace as a farmer or a hired hand and then move forward again after a while. But because he was passionate about the history, the folklore, and the paranormal stuff, when he was in an area, he would collect the stories. And he heard stories about this kind of an animal, just a beast, whatever it was. And it was described very much the same way. And he staked out this old church where he was told it would come past this old church, go down through the woods behind it, and there was a sinkhole back there that it would travel down. And the local people said to the pits of hell. I don't know if that's romance or what it is, but it could be. And he actually had an experience of seeing it. And he writes about it in his one book. I think it's in the Screaming Skulls, if anybody wants to look up the book. I remembered that story when Doug had told it to me. And I thought, oh my stars. Like that was a one-off when I read it when I was about 13. And now all of a sudden I'm standing in a place where something like that actually could have happened. And then I found out years later about in South America, these are fairly common. So my guess is there's some sort of a demonic or earth spirit. But I think they're just an earth spirit because they don't, none of the stuff I've seen so far indicates that they damage people. Now, some of the South American ones do seem to be more violent, but the vast majority of the stories I've read are very much like what I just told.
Just observational.
They watch people. I don't know why they watch people. I don't know what they think they're looking for. Maybe they're just curious about us, but they just stand back and watch what we're doing. So I just think that's a fascinating story. It's always intrigued me. And I've spent countless hours on the Ridge Road, both day and night, waiting for it. I found some really weird stuff on the Ridge Road. Like, for example, wild grapevines that were trained to become a natural covering, and you could climb inside of it and take shelter. Trees that were bent over and trained in that direction. Scratching at about the 7.5, 8 foot height That's a large black bear, if it's a bear. And I don't know anything else that would be 7 or 8 feet tall that would do that. Most black bear aren't quite that big. Um, Tree knocking, I've heard that. And so like at the beginning, that's what I thought. I thought Bigfoot. It's some sort of Bigfoot with a mange. I mean, that made as much sense as anything. But over the course of time, whatever it is, it's physical, or something in there is physical. Maybe they're not the same thing. Because I found some really crazy stuff. Like, who makes a grape harbor and then wraps the leaves around so you have a hole for an opening until you've created a doorway, and then it's cleared out inside, but the whole outside with those big wide leaves offers you great shelter. I don't know what it is. I just know that it's one of those enduring mysteries that I actually got to share a little glimpse of. So, but it's a family favorite. My kids love this story. And another story that I got to share a little glimpse of was, well, actually, this one I lived through quite a lot, was, it's called The Pink Room. And it's because it is, when I was about 15 years old, my mother moved a lot. So when I was 12, my dad died, and my mother had a restless soul the rest of her life. And we never left the area because she didn't want us to leave the school. But every 6 months to a year, she would pick up and move everything we had to another old farmhouse. So I had quite a tour of old farmhouses as a young kid. They are drafty, they are cold, they are huge. I find them charming, as did my mother. But they are not a good place to raise little children because it is cold. There's very little heat, sometimes no heat on the second floors of these places. And Pennsylvania can get bitter. So you ended up like boxed into 2 rooms in the middle of the winter. And that was it. So we moved into this house. This was like the nicest looking, fairly well remodeled one we had ever rented. So I was kind of hopeful we would stay there because it was, it was clean. It was in good shape. There was heat and air all through it. It wasn't the same kind of ramshackle that my mom usually got. And I think she was thinking she was going to stay in it because she had gotten the oil barrels filled. It was September. And that's no mean feat to pay for, like, $400 or $500 for fuel back then. So I knew she was planning to stay. And we almost believed it enough to like unpack our stuff. But because my sister and I had so many sudden moves, because my mom didn't like talk about it. She just called you up on a Tuesday and said, we're moving Friday. Get the stuff ready. And so we didn't unpack everything. But anyway, my room has it panned out. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs. There was one at the far back. That was my sister's room. There was one at the very beginning of the stairs. That was my mother's room because it was the master bedroom. And the middle room was mine. It was painted the most audacious, gaudy shade of pink in a human being. It was Pepto-Bismol pink. It was
That's pink.
horrendous. Oh yeah, it's pink. It was pink to the point it was so loud you couldn't sleep sometimes. I didn't like the room from the moment I got there. As you went through the door, there was a window directly in front of you and a window off to the side. And in between those 2 windows was a corner. And in that corner, you always felt like somebody was glaring at you. Not that they were physically there, but like you knew something was watching you and it was hateful, like it didn't want you there. It was an awful feeling. And I tolerated it. I had heard my uncle say about when he helped us move in that he didn't like that room and that it felt like somebody was watching you the whole time. And I had already decided that I didn't like that room because it just was a creepy room. And I had several weird things happen. My mother had a good friend who came to stay. She was placed in my room with her dog. Her dog went insane whenever we got it to the door. It was this big teddy bear of a dog. And she backed out of the room and she said, oh my, I'll sleep on the couch downstairs. There's just something nasty in that room, honey. Did you tell your mom? And I'm like, my mom won't listen to me. And she wouldn't because it was against her faith. And so I would make it my job when I got home from school to go up and get anything I needed from the second floor before dark. And there was a butcher's shower or a farmer's shower, whatever you want to call it, in the basement. Now you have to understand, I'm willing to go to the basement, back to this old cement room with this rickety shower that looked like it had seen better days about 50 years ago, and it was filthy and I had to scrub it and it was just nasty. And I was willing to go there as a teenager to take a shower rather than in the remodeled bathroom because it was directly across from my room, and you always felt like this thing was watching you even when the doors were closed. Relatives came and visited, also the same story. In fact, I had a brother who wouldn't go upstairs after a while. He wouldn't tell us why. And there was this one night we had 2 kittens we had gotten, and it was just a quiet, normal night, and the kittens would sleep in my room with me. I've always been the crazy cat lady. And on this night, the cats wouldn't come in to my room at all. They'd sleep in the hallway. They were sitting in the hallway staring at something. You know how cats will just watch something and there's nothing there to see? And you're sure there's something there to see because the cats look like they're seeing it.
Mhm.
And it was like that. So I'm like, I left the door open, and I actually put my door so close to the bed that I was literally 2 steps before you could be into the hallway. That's all it took. Like, I was so sandwiched up against that door, it was crazy. But it was the safest place to be as far as I was concerned. It was as far from that corner as I could get. And on this night, I went and got the kitten in the hallway that was mine, brought her in. She's mewling and carrying on and like not wanting to be in there. All of a sudden, the door slammed. There was a pole light outside, so I know I saw what I saw. The curtain started billowing in like it was a really bad windstorm, but the window was shut. The kitten screamed and scratched its way out of my arms and hit that door, and it only took me a second to go out after that kitten. So, it was that kind of scary. And then I'm going to come to the event that was seminal to this. So when my mother worked, because she was a widow, she had friends that were a minister and his wife, and they were who we were to call when she was working night shift because she had to rotate. So on this particular morning, it was early in the morning, it was in the spring, about 4 or 5 in the morning, just beginning to get that gray light. My sister's bedroom, I heard what sounded like a shotgun go off. And I went flying into her room. First of all, we had no guns, so I don't know where that noise came from, but I thought somebody was outside below the house shooting at the house. That was the only thing that made any sense at all, because I knew we had no guns. And my sister's backed up on the bed, and she goes, "It came from the closet." And she's really wide-eyed and rattled, and I've ripped the closet door open, and at the time I didn't take any notice of it, but there was nothing in there but a couple coat hangers with like belts on them from old dresses she had outgrown. I was like, oh my gosh, what do we do? And I'm looking around, and it's because it's spring, it's pretty open. The fields haven't grown up yet or anything like that. Nothing. And I said, I'm gonna call Bill. I'm gonna call Bill. That was my mom's friend. So I ran downstairs, I called him, and she came with me, and we told him there was something going on. His wife got on the phone, and she's like, girls, you just stay put. Don't go anywhere. Don't, just lock the doors. We're on our way. So they get to the house, and we're rattled. We're in our night clothes. And he says to his wife, Connie, go get the girls some clothes. And he starts for the steps, and she starts to go up the steps to get clothes. And he's like, no, whatever's up there, I don't want you to see it. And I said, there's some clothes in the basement because the washer and dryer was in the basement. And she says, run down and get them. So we all three trooped down together and got the clothes. And we got dressed in the basement as much as we could. And we went back upstairs, and Bill was up the stairs doing whatever he was doing. And about 5 minutes after we came back up from the basement, he comes running down the stairs, and he looks ashen. And he yells at her, get the girls in the car now, now. And we turn and we all run. Like, you could feel his fear. Were you ever around somebody who was so afraid you caught it? You caught that fear?
Sure.
That's what it was like. We got to their house, and his wife busied us, getting some food and what have you, because they were nice people. And he went to the den, which is his place where he did his pastoral studies and did, therapy sessions and stuff. And he called my mom, and when she got there, she went directly into his office. She came out about an hour and a half later. She had been crying, you could tell. And he was as silent and grim-lipped as I'd ever seen a man. And he was a guy who was normally a prankster and always joking and smiling, but he was dead serious. And that scared me, because that isn't him. And what would be so terrifying, I thought to this day, I think the world of this man. Like he was the pastor who showed me that men could really be real pastors. He really lived his faith. Like he gave up a job as an engineer to come seed churches and live on absolutely nothing. And time after time, amazing things happened. And somebody gave them a house, or somebody would stop by and hand them a check for $20,000 and say, this is to help you pastors, you do this or that. It was insane the way it worked. I really had nothing but mad respect for this gentleman and his wife. They gave up and risked everything they had and went from being very well-to-do to poor for their faith. And I knew him to be a good man, and I knew him to be a man who wasn't afraid of anything. I mean, I'd heard stories of him doing exorcisms and stuff like that. So whatever it was scared him. And that's terrifying when you're a teenager, that like the dude you thought was Superman was afraid. My mother just came to the kitchen and she said, we're going to move on Friday, girls, and you're going to stay here with Bill and Connie until that happens. And we'll go down Friday and pack everything up. Which was, like I said, we didn't unpack anymore because it was just common knowledge we were going to pack again in a couple of months, so don't bother. So it wasn't an ordeal to do that. But to this day, I do not know. My mother went to her death telling me she would never tell me what Bill told her that day. Bill is still alive. Bill has never revealed it, and I don't think he ever will. I don't know what he encountered up there. The only things I know about the property are these, and I don't know if this is helpful to anybody or not. The property had a penchant for catching fire, not the main house, but the barns. It caught fire on 3 occasions. At one point, it caught fire, and it was a turkey farm, and several hundred turkeys were burned alive. And then the guy who owned it at the time I lived there had a young cattle barn, and it caught fire and the young cattle died. Now, just so people understand, it sounds like it's an insane thing, but when you're dealing with farms and young cattle and stuff like that, there's a lot of things that are flammable. Hay can be flammable. Corn can be flammable if they're not dried properly. Electricity can short out. There's just 100 things. It happens a lot. There's a lot of farm fires. So nobody gave it a lot of thought. And then it happened a second time. And when we moved in, it was fresh enough that you could still smell the burned flesh from the cattle. And I knew that smell because I had smelled it before at a cattle fire on the other side of the town I grew up in. And so I knew exactly what we were smelling. It when the wind would blow a certain way, it would take your breath. So I don't know why, but that property was prone to catching fire and to killing the livestock there. And to this day, I don't know what happened. But that is the story of the pink bedroom.
That begs you to think if Bill did exorcisms, which the logical conclusion of that is that they were demons. If demons were something he had encountered and faced head on, but this scared him that. So what trumps a demon? What's next up besides the devil himself?
It's the only thing I can think of. Or something that went beyond what he believed to be true.
Or yeah, like you said, it was your mother didn't believe in certain things because it was not part of her faith. So
yeah,
maybe this was something that challenged his faith to the degree that he just couldn't face it.
And I think whatever it was, it challenged his faith and her faith. I don't know. I don't know what it was. I probably won't ever know what it was, to be honest with you. It's always bothered me. When I was young, I used to nag every so often. Like, come on, Mom, I'm not a little girl anymore. Come on, Mom, I'm like 30 years old. Come on, Mom, I'm like 40 years old. And she would just look at me and go, no, Pat, no. Bill and I promised we would take it to our graves. And I think they're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I have no clue what it is. I'm gonna there's a couple stories I'm gonna skip for tonight, but if everybody likes these stories, reach out and tell us, and I will do some more of these stories. These are to me are amazing stories. And I'm going to go to 2 stories that I really wanted to make sure I told tonight. And the first one is about something that's called the Fulton Opera House. Now it's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and it's really the ghost part of it's about the opera house, but I think that you need to know what happened there previously. So back to the fall of 1763, Pontiac's Rebellion is still going on. And there's different groups of Native Americans from different areas, and they all agree to go to battle an attack on certain dates, and and they're killing. So this, as you can possibly imagine, was not something that the local folks wanted to deal with. Like, you just didn't want to have to deal with it. So they banded together and created a group of rangers, I guess would be the best word for it. Okay, about 50 strong. And they were led by a pastor from the area. They had applied. Now, I want to make sure everybody understands this is a vigilante group, but this is a vigilante group that came because the governor, his name was Governor Hamilton at the time, they had applied for aid, for help. Send us soldiers, send us somebody to secure us, help us. And this went on for over a year, and people were dying. And they didn't know what else was left to do, so they decided to create their own militia and defend themselves. But not only to defend themselves, but to go on the and become aggressive, and go after people. Now, in the area, there were the Susquehannock Indians, as in the Susquehanna River. And the Susquehannocks had been pretty much conquered and had become Christians and were being educated by the Moravians, which are a group of monks, ministers, that from a particular religious sect. And so they had become mostly Christian, and they were not violent at the time. That's important to know because it's going to make everything else make sense. They went out led by by Reverend John Elder, and they killed. And they killed, and they killed, and they killed. Again, it's that same dynamic. You could have not done a single thing wrong to these people. They killed you because of who you were. And it was the same with Pontiac and his people. You didn't have to do anything wrong to come afoul of them. You just had to be white. And it's the same with the Paxton gang, or the Paxton boys, whichever you want to call them. They were called both in different documents. Again, it didn't matter. You just had to be a Native American. So they went after the Conestoga Indians and the Susquehannock Indians. And when they went after the Conestoga, also under the protection of the Moravians, and a little village called Conestoga, which is originally where the Conestoga wagons of Westward Ho actually began to be developed. That's why they were called Conestogas, because they came from the town of Conestoga. Anyway, these people were in decline at the time, and they were living, many of them, in little mission compounds or little tiny villages. And when I tell you tiny, I'm talking 20, 30, 40 people. They were not a force to reckon with. And it was mostly, by now, the wars had taken enough of its toll that it was mostly old men, little kids, the elderly ladies, and women who were widows, basically. And that's pretty much what it was. There were a few men, but not a lot. And so on the fall of 1763, there were skirmishes going on both sides. They were killing back and forth. Pontiac's group and the Paxton boys, and all of this was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Death was in the air. It stunk of death in that region because they were killing. And the Paxton boys in December heard that there was a group of Conestoga Indians living in the area. And so they decided to go in at dawn and kill them all. So they rode into this little tiny village. And again, it was just a few people. They were not equipped for what was about to occur to them. And they began to kill. Now, the story goes that they picked up a little boy and smashed his head against a rock. Really? He was the first to die. There were 2 women who were shot. One because it was the mother of the child, and she was screaming, and she lost her sense of being able to protect her own self because she was so horrified by what she had just seen. I can't even imagine, God forbid. And there were 2 women in total and 3 old men who were all killed. 14 people managed to escape into the early pre-dawn. They were not equipped to travel through the winter weather because they literally got out of their beds and ran. They slid out the side of the tent and ran. Some of them made it to Philadelphia, where the Moravian missionaries put them in protection. And by the way, they lived under the protection there were 3 in particular who lived under the protection of the Moravian missionaries for the rest of their lives, and they never left Philadelphia again. As long as they were in Philadelphia, it was a capital crime to kill them. Outside of Philadelphia, it was not, so they never left the protection of the Moravians and the Philadelphia people.
Hmm.
There was a guy, a man, and a few others that got caught, and they were taken to the jail in Lancaster. And the Paxton boys wanted them taken to York, where they figured they'd have a better shot at them. So they paid off the sheriff of the little jail in Lancaster. He left the key in the door when he went to lunch. So they broke in and they massacred these people. And it was a horrendous scene. They killed a couple children by hitting them in the head with rifle butts. They cut and stabbed and hacked women to death, laying over the bodies of their children, trying to protect them. They killed a Native American man who was a younger man in his late 30s, early 40s, and but none of them had any ability to protect themselves. They were completely helpless, and there were about 20, 25 of them there for that event. There was the young guy's name was Captain Bill, and he was like the only man of military age, if you would, in that time frame, and he was hacked to death. So they tried to fight back as best they could, but obviously there was nothing at all they could do. And so eventually in the mid 1800s, I think it was 1852 if I'm not mistaken, the little jail gets pulled down and they put the Fulton Opera House in its place. Now, interestingly enough, in the basement is the original entrance to the jail. It still exists. I've been there. The wooden framing, the whole 9 yards still is down there. And in fact, if you go and they offer tours every so often, you can actually go back into that area and see exactly what was there. Now, they don't say that these native people haunt the place. The ghost stories there of, of singers that died and objects being moved by staff who fell off catwalks, that kind of stuff. So it might not sound like a ghost story until we go to the next story. And this is called Revenge and Forgiveness. Fast forward about 60 years. Now, the Reverend John Elder has changed his name to Simon Rostavere to get away from his history of what he had done during the deprivations. He wanted to be distanced from it because he became infamous for what happened there. He has lived a good life. He's still a minister, and he's had a couple daughters, and they were married, and he has grandchildren, and one of his grandchildren is the one he dotes on the most, and she's a teenager of about 16. Blue eyes, blonde hair, amazingly beautiful, and very, very attached to her grandfather. And her name is Jody. So Jody would come every winter and stay with him. His wife had died a long time ago, and she would come and stay through the holidays and take part in the festivities at his church and at the sledding parties and all of these different things. And so on this one cold winter's night in December, Jody's there. She's been there for a couple months, and she wants to go to the sledding party that's being held in town. And he's like, "That you go, honey, but it's too cold for old men. So I'm just going to stay here, and you have fun. And when you're done, you can come home." And so she goes off, all wrapped in her furs with her muff. And for those who don't know what it is, it's an animal fur that they stuff it and then you stick your hands in it and they keep your hands warm. That's what a muff really is. And, she's all decked out and gorgeous. And I'm sure there's a little romance somewhere along the line waiting for her until she comes home. So he had fallen asleep that night, and in his sleep he had dreamt about what happened in what's now the Fulton Opera House, those events, and it startled him awake, and he was afraid, and he's laying in the dark trying to shake it all off because it had been a long time since he had thought about it. But on this night, it was as real as if it happened last night. He could hear their screams, smell the blood, the whole 9 yards. Like no time had gone by at all. So he's really disconcerted by it. And then there's a pounding at the door. And he runs downstairs. He hobbles downstairs at 80. You don't run anywhere, let me tell you. And he opens the door, and there's some of the people from town. And they've got his granddaughter, Jody. And she's wrapped in blankets, and she's unconscious. And that's probably a blessing. She had gotten too close to the fire, and her skirts had caught, and she was badly burned. And his first thought was to send someone to get word to his daughter and let her know what had happened to her child and that they needed to come now. He didn't know how bad it was. The only thing he could tell for sure is that her face was unmarked. His housekeeper ushers the men who are carrying this little girl into this room. They get her clothes pulled off, so they can see how bad the damage is. And she starts trying to do something to help with the pain. And the girl's in and out of consciousness. And he goes in and he's sitting with her. And as he's sitting with her, the time ticks by and midnight comes and midnight goes and he falls asleep and again he hears sounds. And he sees the stuff from 60 years ago again. And he startles awake, and standing in the doorway of his granddaughter's bedroom is a man with robes, feathered robes. And as the figure steps closer into the room, the firelight catches his face, and it was Captain Bill, the man he had killed in that prison cell 60 years earlier. And he had killed him. He knew he was the one who killed him. And he thought, he's come to steal my granddaughter from me. The fear and the terror that ran through this man was insane. And he yelled, "What do you want? Get out of here." And he grabbed a log and he wailed it at the Indian man, and it went right through him. And the Indian man stood there smiling. And he turned around and he walked up the hallway, and he started to the door to the attic. The housekeeper saw this. She was in the room too. And she screamed, "Who's that Indian? What's he doing here?" And the girl opened her eyes and she said, "Papa, is that the man you killed a long time ago?" As though she knew. And he took off running towards the hallway, followed this guy, and the guy went up the stairs, and he turned around at the top of the steps, and then he was just gone. And there was nowhere to hide. It's a big empty room. And he hunted, with a candle, and he looked everywhere, and there was nobody there. And then there's this noise downstairs. It's loud. He hears voices. It's his daughter. She's hours and hours and hours away, like 4 or 5 hours, and it's only been 45 minutes to an hour since they brought his granddaughter. How could she possibly have gotten here in that length of time? And she's downstairs screaming, "What's been going on? What's been going on? Where is Jody? Is she okay?" And he hears his other granddaughter crying, and she's like, "Mama, Mama, we gotta find." And so he goes down the stairs and he leads them to the room, and Jody's in there, and she says to her grandfather, "Papa, where did the Indian man go?" And he's like, "Don't worry about it." She's like, "Is he the one you killed?" And he goes, "I want to talk about it." And the doctor's there and he's trying to treat her. And her mother looks at her father and she goes, "Is he who he was? The one you killed?" And he goes, "Who? What was? Who?" And she's like, "A few hours ago, I was in bed and this Indian man woke me up and said, 'Hurry.' And I just knew immediately that something had happened to either you or Jody, and I had to get going. They caught me on the road. I was almost here. I grabbed my other daughter and I packed up what we needed real quick and I took off because I knew there was something wrong." And he looked and he said, "What?" She's like, "I heard one word, 'hurry.' But I knew something terrible had happened." And old Reverend John Elder began to cry. You see, the man he had chopped to death in that prison cell had just sent him, his daughter, and his other granddaughter in time to protect and help Jody. In fact, Jody would get better and she would live. And Reverend Elder would stand before his entire congregation and tell them who he really was, that he had lied, that he had murdered a man, an innocent man in cold blood, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to parse out the difference between revenge and forgiveness, because his revenge elicited Captain Bull's forgiveness. And if that's not the best ghost story you've ever heard, I honest to God don't know what is. So that's my last ghost story for tonight, guys. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I enjoyed finding them and sharing them with you tonight.
And on behalf of everyone, I'll say thank you very much for those.
You're more than welcome.
Okay.
Isn't that a cool ghost story?
It is, very much so.
I was, when I read those two stories, and I read them separately and found them separately, so it was really interesting. It was like I was led to tell those stories. I had known about the Paxton gang for a long time, but this story about what happened to Reverend John Elder, and had no clue. And I come across it in this really old book, and I'm reading it, and I'm like, no, it can't be the same guy. And I'm flipping back and forth between books, and I'm like, no, it can't be the same guy. And I'm like, holy crap, it's the same guy. And I just thought that was the most amazing story, that the man he murdered went to get help for his granddaughter. He understood the loss of loved ones. He had seen his die. And if anybody ever asks, that's my most underrated story. It's not the one that captures people's imaginations anywhere I go. In fact, I've probably not told that story for 15 years until tonight. I'm done.
Okay. All right, then with that, I'll say good night.
Good night.